Hello, everybody. Today we're going to be talking about education and labor markets. Now, you might be thinking, I thought this whole section was about labor markets, right? But as you can imagine, as someone who's enrolled in college right now, education plays a pretty big role in people's decisions in the labor market. What types of jobs they're going to get, what their pay is going to be, and these types of things. So when we think about supply side and demand side arguments for differences by gender in labor market experiences, a lot of this kind of discussion about education falls on the supply side explanation of things. Um, so supply side explanations for gender differences in earnings focus on the observation that men and women may come into the labor market with different qualifications. And you can probably think about how it's more likely for women to have an English degree and it's more likely for men to have an engineering degree. And so, why is this the case? Are these differences in preferences, or is this some type of societal discrimination? Societal discrimination is sometimes called pre labor market discrimination. It just denotes the multitude of social influences that cause women to make decisions that are adversely influencing their status on the labor market. But in general, here, I think discrimination might be a pretty heavy word to use for a lot of folks. Um, so we could just think about preferences, right? Are these choices, where maybe women are more likely to get English degrees and men are more likely to get engineering degrees? Are these just differences in preferences, right? Do people just kind of decide to do that? Maybe men just prefer engineering, maybe women just prefer English. Um, but I like to point out, and that's kind of this point down at the bottom here that says preferences are endogenous, right? We're all products of our environment. We're all influenced by the people around us, by gendered expectations. So even the things that you like or that you think you like might be influenced by a lot of these other factors. So in general, right, it's difficult to draw the line between voluntary choice and societal discrimination. Now, some of the demand side arguments for explaining gender differences in earnings focus on hiring decisions, focus on discrimination. We'll discuss both of these a bit more later. But some demand side factors might also influence some of these supply side factors. So if you think about labor market discrimination, this might reduce women's or even men's incentives to invest in particular jobs. Or to even invest in certain types of education, right? Maybe women aren't getting engineering degrees because they think that they will have a negative experience in the field, right? Or maybe men aren't going and getting nursing degrees for the same reason, right? And so this is something we'll talk about. Before we get started, though, let's think about a little bit of terminology. Human capital is kind of a funny word that economists use. It essentially just means like the stock of skills and knowledge that workers possess. So that means that a human capital investment is just any augmentation in an individual's stock of skills or knowledge. And it's like a physical capital investment, right? If you go and go to school and or learn a new skill, maybe in some on-the-job training, these are going to make you more productive. It's going to make your labor more productive, just like a physical capital investment might be, right? If someone owns a factory and they go get new equipment or new technology, right? That's physical capital, and that's making them more productive, right? Able to produce more goods. But generally, you can think about how borrowing for human capital, to finance human capital, so you can maybe think about student loans, for instance, is a bit different than borrowing to finance for physical capital. This is largely due to the lack of collateral, right? If I go out and buy a car, right, and I need a loan for that car, the car kind of counts as collateral, right? If I don't pay back my loans, the bank can take my car. The bank can't really take your brain or like force you to work. So that's why there's kind of some differences here when we think about borrowing to finance these two different types of capital. There's lots of different ways that someone can make human capital investments. I think the two kind of main ones that economists look at are formal schooling, which is largely what we're going to be talking about today, and on-the-job training, which we're not really talking about today, but that's another key component of human capital investments that economists often look at. So here's a little bit of data. I'm sorry for the quality of the image, but it's from the Blau, Ferber, and Winkler paper that we're all meant to read. Um, so in any case, you can go look at the article and maybe the quality of the image will be better. But here, right, we're comparing the difference between men and women's educational attainment in the 1970s and also in 2015. Now, you'll notice that for both men and women, they're both, from the 1970s to 2015, they're both investing in a lot higher levels of education. So if we look, for instance, in this bottom bit here, this black piece at the bottom, that's people with less than 4 years of a high school, of high school. So people who don't have a high school diploma. Right, this kind of lighter gray is people who have 4 years of high school. This even lighter gray is people who have some college, and then this kind of white box on the top is people who have 4 years or more of college. So in general, from the 1970s, it looks like quite a few people are only, going to high school at maximum, right? Especially women. But if we look over in this 2015 data categories, we see both men and women are certainly investing in more education than they were in the past, particularly women. And that's kind of what this slide is reiterating, but it's also kind of pointing out that maybe some of this rising educational attainment for men in particular might be underestimated. The reason that we say that is because this graph that we just looked at, right, this previous graph, underestimates gender differences in the share of high school dropouts because they don't include the incarcerated, who tend to be less educated, namely high school dropouts, and overwhelmingly male. So we might be kind of missing some of these people in the data. And this understatement is bigger in 2015 relative to 1970 due to an increase in incarceration rates, which we'll talk about a little bit when we talk about men in labor force participation. But in general, right, in the 1970s, we saw that men were more likely to invest in a higher education than women. By 1980, though, women caught up with men in terms of college graduation rates and then surpassed them. So in more recent years, by 2015, the proportion of women who had completed 4 years of college was 3.3 percentage points higher than the proportion of men. In fact, almost 60% of bachelor's degrees are awarded to women, and that was in 2014. That data is from 2014. So if we look kind of at those individuals a little bit in more detail, we can break it down by year, which is what we're looking at on this column over here to the left. And we can also look at the level of their education. So we can look at if they've got an associate's degree, bachelor's degree, master's degree, PhD, or professional degree. A professional degree is really just something like a degree in law, or a veterinary degree or a dentistry degree, right? Kind of things beyond bachelor's, but not quite in the same category as master's or PhD. So in general, it looks like, of course, in these earlier years, women are kind of not as likely to be getting these types of degrees across the board. When we look to more recent data, it looks like women are actually getting the majority of almost all of these degrees. The only one where they are getting only about half of the degrees is if we look at this first professional degree category. There, about 49% of those degrees are going to women. But in all these other categories, associate's degree, bachelor's degree, master's degree, PhD, in all these other categories, women are now earning more of these degrees relative to men. And we might be able to trace this back to some information to do with their high school achievements. In the past, girls achieved higher class rank than boys and did better in reading, but tended to lag behind boys in mathematical achievement scores, right? So SATs, things like this. But in more recent years, girls continue to have higher GPAs, so they still have higher class ranks on average, have widened their gaps in reading, so are still doing quite well in reading, and have also narrowed the gaps in math scores. So we'll talk about kind of a little bit, why is this the case? Why are girls kind kind of doing better in math? Why are boys not kind of catching up in reading? So let's think about that. And I think it would be good for us to talk about in the discussion posts if folks are interested. But this kind of shift in girls moving from, like primarily doing well in reading in high school, but now doing well in both, might also mean that there's shifts in what they decide to study when they're in college, right? So this is looking at bachelor's degrees awarded to women by field from 1965 or 66 to the more recent years, right, 2013 to 2014. So again, we could look at some of these things that maybe don't surprise us as much. For instance, if we go down to education, English literature, foreign languages, health, home economics, which I'm not really sure how many universities have a bachelor's degree in home economics anymore, but in any case, and sociology, right? And most of these are dominated by women. If we go up to some of the, and continue to be dominated by women, right? We're dominated by women in the 1960s and are dominated by women more recently. If we go up to this data up here, these are some of the bachelor's degrees that were predominantly awarded to men in the 1960s. So things like agricultural natural resources, things like biological science and life sciences, things like economics, right? Engineering. We see in general across the board, there's been this increase in the proportion of the degrees given to women. Particularly, right, if we look at things like agriculture and natural resources, now those fields are about 50-50. Biological sciences and life sciences are now predominantly women. We see this jump from 28% women to now 58% women. Economics, which we've talked about a little bit before in this class, still kind of has a bit of a way to go, right? Only 30% of bachelor's degrees awarded are to women. And here are some kind of other interesting ones. These are this history, mathematics, psychology, social sciences. These tend to be a little bit more gender equal in the 1960s and still continue to be a little bit more gender equal, maybe with the exception of psychology, right? As you see, there's a lot of women in psychology now. This data is looking at changes over time in the percent of first professional degrees awarded to women by field. In this darker bar, we're looking at the percent of women who've been awarded these types of professional degrees in 1966. In the lighter gray, we're looking at the same thing, but for the year 1981. And then in the next kind of top bar, we're looking, these bars, right? We're looking at the proportion of women who are getting these degrees in 2014. Something that always really jumps out to CSU students in particular is this huge shift in veterinary medicine degrees. And I think, in fact, there are probably a lot of veterinary medicine students in this class, right? But we see in 1966, only 8% of these degrees were awarded to women. Now it's roughly 80%. And that's a pretty big jump, but the rest of them follow a similar trend, right? Just in general, increases in women getting these degrees, right? Medicine, law, business, and dentistry all seem to be close to 50-50 men and women now. Pharmacy and veterinary medicine are becoming dominated by women. Theology is still dominated by men. Okay, so why do people make these decisions? Like, how do people decide that they're going to go to college, and then how do people decide what they're going to study? Well, we want to think about kind of this decision on the margin, right? So thinking about how do people decide to go to college, or if they want to just work immediately after high school, right? How do people make that decision? Well, they want to think about their costs and their benefits. There's certainly direct costs, so you could think about tuition, fees, books, student loan interest. But there's also indirect costs or opportunity costs, which we've talked about already a little bit in this class. Right, the opportunity cost for you coming to college and doing this college thing full time might be some foregone earnings. You could have worked full time right out of high school, but you're giving up those earnings right now to come to college. In general, and this is kind of an interesting thing to think about, the opportunity cost of attending college is lower when the economy is weak. So if you look back at data, for instance, about the recession, the 2008-2009 recession, more people than usual enrolled in college, right? And this is because they weren't giving up as much to go, right? The opportunity cost wasn't as high. They couldn't get jobs right out of high school with earnings that were very high. So they said, okay, my opportunity cost to go to college right now is pretty low, so I guess I'll do it, right? Another thing that people think about, of course, aside from these costs, are the benefits, right? Like, what am I going to get if I decide to go to college versus just work right out of high school? And to measure this, economists look at the college wage premium. The college wage premium tells us how much a college educated worker earns compared to a high school educated worker. We have some data on this, so let's look. This is if we look on this horizontal axis, right, we have the age of individuals. On the vertical axis, we have their average earnings. And this is data from 1974. In general, it looks like for men with 4-year degrees, they're earning quite a bit more than men with 4-year high school degrees. And you can kind of see this steep increase over time, right? It pays off even throughout your lifespan to be someone, a man in particular, right, who gets a 4-year college degree. For women, right, in these two lines down here, in 1974, women with 4-year college degrees were on average still earning less than men with 4-year high school diplomas. And their gap wasn't quite as wide, right? The gap between women who have college degrees and women who have high school degrees, the gap in their earnings is just not as wide as it is for men, as you'll see up here. But this has changed quite dramatically. So this is data from 2014. You'll see that women with just high school diplomas are still earning the least amount on average. But now the gap for women who have college degrees and the earnings of women who have just high school degrees, the gap in their earnings is much, much, much wider. And the gap between men who have 4-year college degrees and men who just have high school degrees is also still pretty wide. So what these graphs are telling us is that the college wage premium has gone up, right? Let's go back to the definition. It says how much a college-educated worker earns compared to a high school-educated worker, where that gap has gone up for both men and women, but has gone up a lot more for women. So it pays for women to go to college now, where maybe before it didn't pay as much. So that's the idea with this data. So people are thinking about the college wage premium. They're thinking about their opportunity costs and other kind of direct costs when they decide to go to college. But what about once they get there? How do they decide what field they're going to pursue? How do they decide what discipline they're going to study? And so here it might be interesting to think about the socialization and expectations about what's maybe feminine and what's more masculine. There's some really interesting data. This is data from the United Kingdom, where the scholars are using in-depth interviews to document the experiences of British men who are working in women-dominated occupations. So, like for instance, in librarians or nursing or flight attendants, they find that men who work in these types of jobs, these men are distancing themselves from the women colleagues and also from the feminine aspects of the job. For instance, they talk about how librarians, who are men, often would refer to themselves as information scientists instead of librarians, kind of emphasizing the more quantitative aspects of the job, the more scientific parts of the job, a more masculine part of the job. Similarly, they find that male nurses kind of tended to work more in the ER, where things were more fast-paced, things were more intense, right? They're emphasizing this idea with pressure, working under pressure. So the male nurses are working more in the ER than they are in other aspects of the hospital. They similarly find that male flight attendants emphasize kind of aspects of safety over service. So again, kind of thinking about maybe more traditionally masculine aspects of these jobs. So I think this is kind of interesting evidence to think about how I think people do still kind of make a lot of their career decisions, not just about not just on earnings, right? Not just thinking about earnings, but also thinking about kind of how their identity fits in with these types of jobs and how they might fit in with the other people working there. And that's kind of another thing to think about, right? Like there's subtle barriers to going into certain types of jobs. Maybe jobs that are dominated by one gender might discourage the other from entering, right? I kind of already mentioned this, but maybe like a lot of women aren't going into things like economics because there's a lot of men in economics and they might not feel welcome. Similarly, you could say the same thing about men going into teaching or nursing, right? Maybe they feel discouraged that it's dominated by women. You could also think about kind of this lack of role models in specific fields. The role of mentors is really important. And mentors who are men, for instance, might not identify with women mentees or vice versa. And you also want to think about informal networks. And there's certainly, we observe gendered sorting on things like coffee breaks, lunches, things like this, right? And so if you're going to lunch, with people of your same gender, and maybe your gender, is underrepresented in your field, right, then maybe you're not going to be able to climb up the ladder as quickly. So that's the idea here with that. Something I would like to kind of end on and have us think about and write about in the discussion posts is, well, but like, why? Why have girls recently been pursuing more education than boys? Well, we've already talked about how women kind of have this higher returns to college than they were before, right? They have a higher college wage premium than they did before, so maybe that's why we're seeing kind of droves of women coming into colleges and getting degrees. They also maybe have higher labor force attachment than before, meaning, and we'll talk about what labor force attachment means in the future, but it basically just means that maybe they're not as likely to leave the labor market because they're having children, for instance, right? A lot of women now who have children tend to stay in the workplace, and so it makes sense to kind of invest in this degree and get a job that's going to pay you a lot if you're going to be staying there even after you have children. Another thing that's kind of worth thinking about is the fact that occupational segregation has declined very little in blue-collar occupations, meaning that blue-collar occupations are still largely dominated by men, which provides not a lot of new opportunities for less educated women. I think a useful example here is to think about how things like waitressing or being a server are dominated by women and tend to pay less than things like working in a mechanic shop or being an arborist, right? These types of jobs pay quite a bit more than being a waitress, but are still very gender segregated. There's not a lot of women working in these types of fields, right? Like, again, being a mechanic or being an arborist or what have you. And so because women have limited opportunities in these kind of jobs that require less education but are still decently paying, they might decide to go get an education at higher rates than men. But what's the deal with boys in particular, right? And there's some interesting data that tells us that boys in lower income families or boys in poorer school districts are less successful than girls in the same scenarios. So what's happening? Like, why are education systems kind of failing boys in some ways and working just fine for a lot of girls? And some of these scholars have suggested maybe this has to do with like over disciplining boys. Some have suggested that there's like higher rates of ADHD diagnoses in boys. So this is something I'd kind of like to think about and hear your opinions on. So please go and write in the discussion post if you still need some participation points. And just to wrap things up, what I expect you to kind of know from this slideshow is just firstly these general trends in educational attainment in the US, right? We've seen women going and getting degrees in higher education at much higher rates, so they're going into different types of fields. And also I want you to consider how individuals make decisions about investments in their education. So think about the costs, think about the benefits, think about the college wage premium, think about some of these other things that I just discussed, right? This stuff about occupational segregation and blue-collar occupations, and these types of things. But in general, that's all I've got for us today, and I will see you all next time.